Hey everyone, and welcome to the Polsky Small Business Bootcamp. My name is EJ Reedy. I'm a Senior Director at the Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, which operates out of the University of Chicago, supporting students, staff, faculty, and entrepreneurs on the south and west sides of Chicago in their pursuits of entrepreneurship. We're so excited to have you here today to join us at this particularly important and difficult time for many small businesses. Hey everyone, and welcome to the Polsky Small. Over the course of the next week, we're going to offer 10 sessions in which entrepreneurs and small businesses here on the South Side, across Chicago, nationally and internationally, can get access to top information and experts around entrepreneurship and small business management. So before we begin, I'd like to thank our other sponsors in this great work, particularly the Restandi Center for Social Sector Innovation at the University of Chicago and the Office of Civic Engagement, along with a broad coalition of university partners. It's my true pleasure today to introduce George Wu, who will be leading us through negotiating in times of change. Today's session will be led by George, who is a professor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, the John P. Lillian and A. Gould Professor of Behavioral Science. George is both a personal friend and a leading academic expert in a number of areas. He studies psychology of decision-making, goal setting, and motivation, and cognitive biases in bargaining and negotiation. Additionally, he has received research funding and is part of a 3-year, $3.6 million project entitled Enhancing the Human Experience Through Behavioral Science, New Pathways to Purpose. His research has been published widely in a number of journals, including Cognitive Psychology, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, the Journal of Risk and Uncertainty, Management Science, Psychological Science, and the Quarterly Journal of Economics. I'm so excited to welcome George today and to kick off the Polsky Small Business Bootcamp. Please help me welcome George Wu to the Small Business Bootcamp. Thank you, George.
All right, thank you, EJ. I'm going to share my screen, so let's see how this works. I think you should now see my PowerPoint. See if is that showing up?
Yes.
PowerPoint up? Okay, I'm not. Oh, okay.
Your PowerPoint, George.
I'm sorry?
We can see your PowerPoint. You're good to go.
All right. Thank you. So everyone's figuring out exactly how to navigate Zoom. So thank you. Thank you all for being here. I'm honored to be speaking today and to launching this wonderful program that University of Chicago is doing. And really, I want to thank you all in the small business community for all you do and contributing to the vitality and diversity and economic development of Chicago. I'm hoping that what I say a little bit about negotiation, it can help all of you deal with some of the negotiation challenges that you're facing during this health crisis. But I think beyond that, I'm also hoping that that this health crisis is short-lived, as we all are, and that as we move to the back end of this, that these principles can also be useful in helping you to continue to grow and prosper once this thing is done. All right, with that as an introduction, one of the things I want to do is just start out a little bit and give you a high-level idea about how, at least I think about negotiation. So I teach negotiation to lots of audiences. I teach in our MBA program with in sort of a basic class as well as an advanced class. I teach to lots of audiences, our executive ed program. I teach to people around Chicago, small businesses, big businesses, people in the social sector, people in the government. And one of the things that I think should be obvious, but I'll try to make this point a little bit more clearly, is that negotiation really does help. And there's a couple of aspects to this that I think are worth elaborating on. First of all, is that I think obviously we're living in this tumultuous time at this particular moment. Negotiation, I think, is a skill that is extremely useful, whether it's about renegotiating existing contracts, whether it's forging agreements for new work, whether it's dealing with people inside your organization who you would like to take on different work or somehow navigate the difficulties of managing their personal and professional lives in this very hard situation. Negotiation has a lot to offer, and we'll talk about that. But I think on the other side is that, as I said, once we are on the back end of this, I'm also hopeful that you take away something about how negotiation is useful in calmer times and presumably all times in the middle. The second thing is that we'll talk a little bit about what defines effective negotiating, but I think that beyond effective negotiating, I think part of what one of the skills of negotiation is recognizing the time and place for initiating conversation. So negotiation, I think, is something where it demands you to recognize situations in which there is a conversation to be had. And the final idea is that it's important to recognize that negotiation is about producing both good outcomes, but also good relationships. So I think if we look at Hollywood, oftentimes the negotiators who are featured on the big screen are people who are pushy and aggressive and so on, and people who compromise relationships. I think the important thing is to recognize that this is good for both outcomes as well as relationships. Okay. Second thing is that negotiation is not a panacea. And what I mean by that is that I think that negotiation helps, but to recognize that sometimes there's just not possibly a deal that can be had. And I think that one of the things is, unfortunately, that may very well be true during this time in which resources are limited and so on. But we'll talk about how negotiation, I think, it gives you the best chance of reaching a deal as possible. And the last thing is that, and this will be a kind of theme that we'll pick up on for much of the rest of what I'm going to say, is that effective negotiating requires sizing up both situations as well as people. So there is a particular situation that you're in that might be forging an agreement for new work, talking with an individual in your organization to get stuff done, renegotiating a lease, and there's a person on the other side who may be a person with which you have a relationship with, maybe a person who's new, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea is that you need to tailor the strategy and interpersonal approach to the situation. Okay, what I'm going to do today is we'll start with some basics. And as we talk about the basics are going to largely apply to all situations. What we'll do is, as we go through the talk, we'll talk about the kinds of difficult situations that you're facing more as we move along. There will be examples of hard situations along the way, but not necessarily situations that are kind of one-to-one corresponding with the kinds of difficulties that a lot of small businesses are facing today. We'll have a very short case study about a downstate Illinois farmer named Sarah Talley, who's negotiating with Walmart. And I think a lot of the kind of circumstances there are very similar to the kinds of things that we see right now with the COVID-19 crisis, though not exactly the same. And then we'll take some of your questions and wrap up. Okay, so if we think about negotiation 101, there's a few basics that I think are essential for everybody to recognize and then, of course, to master. First of all, is negotiation is clearly an exercise that involves you and somebody else. And because it's involving at least one other person, it really requires that you put yourself into another person's shoes. In other words, you try to take perspective. And we'll talk about that particular activity. We'll also talk about that activity is not a natural thing for people to do, and I'll give you some illustrations of that. Second thing is that if there's a structural building block for thinking about negotiation, it's to recognize that negotiators are out there to do better than they would by not reaching an agreement. In other words, that both you and your counterpart or counterparts have alternatives to negotiation. And the idea is that a negotiated agreement only makes sense if both parties are getting better for themselves than they could do otherwise. And there's a little bit of verbiage that we use in our negotiation classes. We call that a BATNA, a best alternative to negotiating. The third thing is the reason that you're negotiating is because your job is to satisfy interests that you have. And on the other side, their job is to satisfy interests that they have. And we'll talk about that as a building block for negotiation. And the last thing is that the process of negotiation matters a lot. And I think it matters for lots of obvious reasons, and it matters for lots of reasons that may not be so obvious. And that one thing that I think is important is to recognize that considerations of fairness matter a lot. Okay, so let me start with perspective taking. And I think that there's a lot of psychological research and maybe a little bit of your own introspection, including some works by some of my colleagues, including my colleague Nick Epley, has shown that people aren't very good at taking the perspective of other people. And there's a few things about that. One is that we don't naturally do that. And when we do that, we oftentimes do it badly. Now, in negotiation, that this is required at two different places. Is that one is before you undertake a negotiation, one of the things that you should do is prepare. And in order to prepare, one of your jobs is to anticipate the needs and desires and, let's just say, obstacles that your counterpart can have. That's preparation for stuff that you do before the table. At the table, what you're doing is negotiating, and what you're trying to do is ask questions and listen in ways that help you to understand the other side. So let me tell you a quick story that gives you a little bit of an idea about the limits of perspective taking. And the story goes like this. There's a developer in London. This is probably about 3 decades ago. The developer is trying to put together a large hospital. What they need to do is acquire a bunch of real estate. And what real estate developers do in these kinds of situations is they try to do this on the quiet. And the reason they do this on the quiet is that if everybody knows that they're trying to acquire all this land, they get at the end of the line, and if you get at the end of the line and you're the last piece of property to be bought, then you can perhaps get an extraordinary amount of money for that piece of property. So the developer is incredibly good at doing this, and in fact has acquired all the bit of land except for one house. And he offers this person who owns his house at this point a very large amount of money, up to £50,000, £200,000, £250,000, and every time gets a no. And finally, he goes in and he talks to the old lady. It turns out to be an old lady. He discovers an old lady, knocks at the door, and has a conversation. And one of the things that he asks is a little bit about why she has any problems selling the house. And the story is the following, which is that she tells the developer that, first of all, that she is old, and that she unfortunately does not have that much to live for, and the only thing that she had until a couple years ago was her cat, which has been a companion for years, and that cat unfortunately passed and is buried in the front yard. And it turns out that this, unremarkably, is something that is probably impossible for anybody else to ever figure out. On the other hand, I think once that somebody is willing to share this as a particular idea, it's clear that you can come up with a solution. In fact, the developer at that particular point, first of all, expressed empathy and sympathy with the lady, eventually slowly bridged the question about what to do when she eventually will pass. And they came up with a solution that was much better. Okay. So what's the implication? One implication, and we'll talk a little bit about exactly how to do this, is that we should try to put ourselves in the shoes of other people, but we have to be modest about how much we're doing this. Okay, the second thing is the bad note. So recognize that negotiation is one means of getting a desired outcome, but something happens to both parties if they don't reach an agreement. We call this the BATNA. And of course, the recognition is that each party is trying to do better for themselves. I'm trying to do better, you're trying to do better by negotiating than we would do otherwise. So what otherwise is what we call BATNA. In other words, the idea is that you should ask yourself two questions. What happens to you if you don't agree? And what happens to the other party if they don't agree? And I think that neither question is actually a natural question for people to ask. My MBA students don't ask this question naturally. When I teach executives, they don't ask this question naturally. They have to sort of build this as part of the muscle memory to ask this particular question. And the second thing, of course, that they don't ask is they don't ask what's going to happen to the other side. Now, a quick story is a story about Teddy Roosevelt. So as all of you know, Teddy Roosevelt was the president at the beginning of the previous century. When he was campaigning for the presidency, he did these famous whistle-stop tours, which is he got on trains, the train would stop, he'd get out, and he'd give out pamphlets and other kinds of things and give short talks. Right before they are ready to embark on one of these whistle-stop tours, it occurs to them they have a problem, which is that they have this pamphlet that has a beautiful picture of Teddy Roosevelt on the cover, and the photo has on the lower right corner something that says Charles Moffett Copyright, Charles Moffett Studios. And it occurs to the campaign manager that they have not procured an arrangement to use this particular image. And this is a long time ago. Copying is extremely hard to do. You can't just go to Kinko's and do this again or do this on your own laser printer. They are half an hour from basically leaving the station, and they have a lot of pamphlets that they can't use or maybe shouldn't use. So the question is, what do they do? And the campaign manager thinks about this for 5 minutes. He telegraphs Charles Moffett and says, are prepared to use one of your images for our campaign material. How much are you willing to pay us? Now, I think what's extraordinary about this story is that everybody basically thinks about how awful their situation is. And it does sound indeed awful. It doesn't seem like there are very good alternatives in the event that you aren't able to reach an agreement. On the other hand, what they don't think about is the fact that on the other side, one of the big benefits is that there's actually a huge benefit in terms of publicity to actually using this particular photograph. And in principle, one of the things that's possible is that publicity is big enough that the photographer actually should be willing to pay to have his image used for a Teddy Roosevelt. And so what the studio manager, Charles Moffett, did is he said, have never done anything like this, but in these extraordinary times am willing to offer you $250. That amount was taken. So one implication is always ask what happens to you or them if you don't agree. One of the things that we'll also talk about is that sometimes in negotiation, it's extremely useful to imagine an audacious outcome, an outcome that you really shouldn't be thinking about. And I think that sometimes when you think about these audacious outcomes, you end up generating alternatives or strategies that you wouldn't think about otherwise. Okay, the third thing is interest. So one of the things, of course, is that negotiation is a means of getting a desired outcome. And what that means is that everybody should come to the table recognizing what they want out of the negotiation, but also recognize that one of the things that is extremely unlikely that you're able to do is to get everything that you want. And what that means is that you have to not just understand what you want, but you have to understand the priorities or which of the interests that you have are more important. And the principle, actually, when people talk about win-win in negotiation, it's actually a very, very simple idea. And it involves both sides engaging in a trade, so to speak, in which they give up something which is relatively cheap to them, relatively not so valuable, and in exchange they get something that's valuable. And there's kind of an old story about this. It involves two bickering sisters. I have two daughters who I think on occasion bicker. And the story goes that there's an orange, and one girl says, I want the orange, girl two says, I want the orange, and they're fighting and so on. And then finally, the dad comes in or the mom comes in, pick up the orange and give half to one kid and half to the other kid. And that seems like a fair agreement. It turns out that it's not a very good agreement. It's fair in some way, but it's actually leaves a lot of value on the table, because if they actually asked what the kids wanted, it turns out that girl one wanted the fruit for the obvious reason of eating the orange, but girl two wanted the peel for baking it. And once you realize that, then the obvious solution is to give one girl all the peel and one girl all the fruit. So I think beyond that, one of the things that negotiators often get stuck with is thinking about what we call positions and not thinking about what underlying interests are. So I'll give you one particular example, which is that you have a piece of equipment, piece of equipment isn't working. And what you do is you demand that the machine needs to get fixed by Wednesday. And it turns out that it's actually technically not possible to fix the machine by Wednesday. And this negotiation isn't really going very far. And what you might do at this point is ask yourself, why do you need to get the machine fixed on Wednesday? Very simple question. And the interest is not to get the machine fixed per se, it's to get some critical work done by the end of the week. So there's some customers who are insisting on product. And then the idea here is that once you recognize that the real interest is to get work done, not to get the machine fixed, then what you do is hire a contractor, borrow a machine, or something else. And so one implication is to ask yourself and your counterpart why. So one more story, which is there is a maker of a specialty chemical. There is a chemist who recognized that what they can do is they can take this special chemical and kind of make an extraordinary product out of that. The problem is that their product is not patentable. So what they do is they negotiated the one provider of this specialty chemical and says, what I would like to do is get an exclusive agreement on this specialty chemical. And the owner of the producer of the specialty chemical says, no. And so I offer more, no. I offer even more, no. I offer as much as I possibly could, they say no. And of course, this doesn't really make any sense. And maybe the only way that it makes sense is that the owner of the specialty chemical is playing real hardball. And then finally, the entrepreneur asks, so why are you willing to do this for me? It makes sense. I'm offering you a lot of money. And he says, well, you know what? I can't give you an exclusive because I actually give some of the specialty chemical to my cousin, and I promise that I always will have some available. And then once you realize that, then it's kind of easy to think about the agreement, which is that what you do is you create an exclusive, but you just carve out this cousin and both sides are happy. So last thing is that I think one thing that effective negotiators do is they recognize that we care about two things in negotiation. We care about the outcome. In other words, we care about getting something that we want, but we also care about the process. And the process is the thing that determines whether the relationship is ultimately good or whatever. And that involves things about fairness, and it involves things about whether you were treated with respect. And there's two ingredients to this, is that one is what we call active listening, and two is fairness. And we'll talk a little bit about both. And I think active listening is an incredibly useful skill. And I think especially in this time, and I'll try to say why I think it's important that people be good listeners in this time. But the first thing is to recognize that we don't are naturally good listeners. And so the first thing tenet is that your job is to direct full attention to the listener. And I think one of the things that many of us recognize is that when in this kind of multitasking world is that we don't do that. We're actually not fully engaged in listening to the person who's speaking. And one is to just make sure that you're fully there. The second thing is to confirm to the speaker that you're listening. And you do this by the punctuations that follow what they say. So when EJ says this, I go, yep, right? But the second thing I think is probably more important is that after EJ is done with, say, a paragraph, what I do is I try to paraphrase that. In other words, I say something like, so EJ, what I understand is that one of the reasons why we are doing this program is X, Y, and Z. Is that correct? And then what EJ says at that point is, yes, that's correct, or needs a little bit of modification, or let me start again. The last thing you do is you ask open-ended questions in a respectful manner. So I think that one thing that we do pretty regularly is we ask close-ended questions. And a close-ended question is something like, price is the most important issue, right? That's that kind of question can only elicit one response. On the other hand, a question of the following sort: so tell me what's important to you, or tell me what matters. What do you want to get out of this negotiation? And what that does is that allows the speaker to talk in any way that they want to talk. And what you possibly can hear is things that you wouldn't have anticipated. Now, what that does is, the first thing it does is that listening of this sort establishes liking. And I think this is obvious, but people want to be liked and respected when they speak. And one way to say it is there is no poorer way to show disrespect than by not listening. And so to the extent that you're listening, what that does is that enables the speaker to like you, and presumably you're going to get a better agreement because people that we like, we do good things for. The second thing is it also reinforces talking, which a lot of times in negotiation, talking is information, and what you want them to do is to speak more. And what it also does is it overcomes this difficulty of perspective. As I said before, is we are not necessarily good at understanding what the other side wants, and what we need to do is let them talk and let them tell us what's important to them. The last thing is fairness, as people generally want to be treated fairly, and they generally think of themselves as being fair. Now, that's not always the case, but most people think of themselves as fair, and they think of themselves as wanting to be fair. And one implication is that appeals to fairness can be powerful. So let me tell you one very recent story. I was talking to a friend who had just actually reached an agreement on a purchase of condominium. So actually the agreement happened about a week and a half before the COVID-19 basically started shutting things down. And what this friend asked me is that it seems to me that what I learned is that the seller needs to sell this condo in order to buy another piece of property, and that what I might be able to do in this particular situation is use that particular situation and maybe leverage myself better. Now, that is an advantage to you. And first thing I said is that you're correct in the sense that you probably could use this as a way of leveraging this to your advantage. On the other hand, the second thing I said is, do you actually really want to do this? And I think that the idea is that I said if I were advising your seller, one of the things that I would do is I would say, what you want to do is appeal to fairness. And I think the fairness appeal here is that this is kind of an awful situation. This is an awful situation. And the people who are advantaged and disadvantaged by the situation, it's largely a matter of luck and circumstance. And one way of thinking about this is that you want to treat other people in the same way that you would like to be treated if you were on the other side. And I think that's a very, it's a very human way of acting, but it's also a very compelling way. And I think it's a reminder that I think it's something that's advantage to us strategically in negotiation, but it's also something to remind ourselves that if we do have, let's say, the upper hand in this negotiation, it's a way of recognizing that maybe what we should do is be fair. All right, so let me tell you one quick story. So Sarah Talley is a downstate Illinois farmer. This is a true story, way down in the southeast part of Illinois. At 19 years old, Sarah successfully negotiated with Walmart to become a supplier of a bunch of different kinds of things, including pumpkins and nuts. So about 15 years ago, 2005, it was a terrible year for growing watermelons. And for various reasons, there were harsh growing conditions in the South, which meant that in this year, there were a massive shortage of watermelons. What a lot of farmers do is they source watermelons from the South early on in the year, and then they, later are growing watermelons more locally. And of course, 4th of July is a time when what we want to do is celebrate with our friends and families, have lots of good stuff to eat, including watermelon. Walmart, like many other grocers, wants an abundant supply of watermelons, and they want this in the Walmart way with very low prices. So this is a situation, and one of the reasons I talk about this is I talk about this as a kind of bridge to some of the circumstances that some of you are in. When I ask my MBA students about situations that they think of as really hard, thorny, gnarly situations, many of them come up with the example of negotiating with Walmart. And not surprisingly, Walmart is the big behemoth that has a lot of power and so on. And this is a circumstance where it seems triply, quadruply true that they have a lot of power. And so what Sarah Talley says in this particular negotiation is, recognize that I can't make any money at the prices that you're insisting on. And the buyer in this particular case, who's actually a new buyer to Walmart or new for watermelon, says, your prices are too high and maybe things are going to change by July 4th. You should give us the price that you want. So what I do in my MBA class is I actually have a conversation about this. And one of the interesting things is that there's a tendency to attend to the two obvious options. And about half of my students want to acquiesce, and half of the students want to walk away. So half of the students say, Walmart's so critical that you basically have to give in this particular situation, and half say, you need to walk away because if you acquiesce, then Walmart's going to take advantage of you again. And that may very well be true, but I think that one of the things that people don't naturally think about is they don't think about whether there are other strategies. And in fact, there's a useful question, which is to ask yourself, imagine that you got exactly what you wanted. An outcome that you're kind of ruling out right now, which is that you got them to give the price that you wanted. What did you do? And a second useful question to ask yourself is the question about what we call the bat no, which is if you say no, then what is Walmart's reaction? And one way I phrase it is that their reaction is, oh, something. And there's a few answers that you could imagine, first answer is the kind of typical Walmart answer, which is that they have lots of competitors to you. There are other alternatives. And so they say, oh, well. In other words, that's the typical situation and the reason why most suppliers of Walmart don't have much leverage, because they don't really care that much about you. A second one is they say, oh no. Or a third one is they say, oh, exploitative. And that one of the things that when you follow the logic here is that the answer probably should be, oh no, or worse than that. Because if you are having a hard time supplying watermelons, then so is everybody else. And if you sell them that you're not going to be able to sell them watermelons, then they're going to have to buy watermelons with other suppliers on the spot market. The spot market's going to be extremely expensive because that's just what it is. And that is indeed what happened. So what Sarah said is that she actually kind of was respectful, and she said, you know what, I kind of just disagree with you. And you might be right, or I might be right. And here's the idea, which is that if you're right and watermelon prices are low by July 4th, then what you're going to do is you're going to give me this low price that you're talking about. On the other hand, if the prices are really high, which I think is true, then what you'll do is you'll rebate me that money, or you'll make it back in future years. And it turned out that indeed Sarah was right. It turned out that Walmart realized that they were wrong. They had to essentially buy these watermelons on the open market because she treated them respectfully. She didn't get a deal, but because she treated them respectfully, she got actually a lot of good reputation with them, and they dealt with her in the future. All right, so let me talk about something, and I'm going to take some questions from you in a second. But I think one thing that certainly is on the mind of a lot of small businesses is the question about renegotiating commercial leases. I actually put in paying rent, which is not, couldn't find a search term on Google Trends. Here's a time series of what that looks like. And this just gives you an idea. I probably didn't even have to show you this, but this gives you an idea about what the urgency is in terms of paying rents and whether those are commercial or residential. And there's obviously a lot of attention to this. This is a columnist from the Washington Post, and what she did, Catherine Rampell, she tweeted something: New York City restaurateurs plead with landlords for rent forgiveness and deferment. And the article, which is pretty interesting, it's an Eater, talks about a lot of restaurants and talks about solutions, like some restaurants are looking to use security deposits, others are seeking rent forgiveness, others are contemplating deferrals, and so on. And so this is actually a kind of a situation that I think is one that's ubiquitous, and I think it's one of the things that is useful to kind of think about, kind of using the principles that we talked about. And I think the one quick thing that I think is sort of natural to think about, and people think about this all the time, is that what happens to you if you don't agree? And for lots of small businesses, not all, but this is a catastrophe, because with little or no revenues, they're going to have to furlough employees, shut down, or things that are not necessarily so good. What they don't necessarily look at is the other side, which is what happens to your landlord if you and they aren't able to agree. And the thing is, on that side, it's not, oh well, it's probably, oh no, or oh something else. They may not recognize that, but here is actually a tweet from one of my colleagues, Joe Favre, which is some form of rent reduction seems like will ultimately better for all. If tenants can't pay, it's not like the landlord is going to find someone else to replace them right away. And even when the public health threat is gone, it's harder to fill vacancies than restart existing businesses. And so I think one thing is that all the landlords may not understand this, but that the alternative is not for you to just pay full rent. And a lot of businesses just simply cannot do that. Now, they may be hopeful that you are one of the businesses who was able to pay full rent. But for a lot of businesses which don't have the cash flow to actually make full payment, but can make something, then it seems like a much better kind of situation to take some money, to defer some of these things, to maybe not to actually have all of the burden on the back end, because if you're just deferring the rent and then have to make that up in the future, then that's also probably a recipe for insolvency, which is not good for them either. So I'll close with this, which is that this is actually something that was put together by some of my colleagues, which is actually the start of a lease for renegotiating rent. And actually, it's been vetted by lawyers. And basically, the idea here is that there's only kind of 3 terms that you have to negotiate. And I'll just read this to you. Landlords and their tenants need only agree on the percentage that the rent will be reduced for the next 3 months. This is through July 1st, but this could be changed. What fraction of that reduction will be deferred until later in the lease, and what part will be forgiven or abated. Regular rent payments will resume on July 1st with the deferred rent payments spread equally over the remainder. And there's some recommendations about default. And I think one thing that's nice about this is, one, that it becomes a kind of norm for renegotiating, but the idea is also that there are kind of some sensible starting points that I think make sense for both the businesses for the small businesses as well as the landlords. All right, so I am I'm done with sort of my prepared presentation. I'm eager to hear the questions that all of you have. So I think there's EJ popping back up. Go. I'm eager to hear your questions and the particular issues that you want a little bit more clarity on.
Okay, great. And so just a reminder that you can enter questions in the live stream chat feature, which should be below our video online. So George, the first question comes in, relates to kind of breaking apart some of the different parts of negotiations. So in particular, what are distributive, integrative, and congruent issues in negotiations? And can you compare some of the different aspects of negotiations?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. So one is that when we teach negotiation, we separate between what we call distributive, integrative, and then multi-party negotiation. So I think an easier way to think about this is that there's some issues which are purely about splitting up value. So typically price is an issue like that. So you can think of them as claiming value. One side does better, the other side does worse. There's other issues which are really ones in which they're integrative, in the sense that, like with the example of the oranges, is that one side wants the peel a lot, the other side wants the fruit a lot. What could happen is that I get the peel and you get the fruit. There are other issues which I think are sometimes completely aligned. And so I think one of the things that I think is always useful to think about in terms of business negotiation is that we oftentimes think of the other side as disagreeing with us on everything. Are there things that basically in which we're both unified with? And I think one way that I think both sides are unified is that they both want successful, solvent, vibrant businesses. And to the extent that there are things in the lease that can contribute to vibrancy, that's something that is clearly good for the landlord. It's also clearly good for small business. Okay.
All right. So George, a question related to sales. So one of the things that I've been tracking the last few days is ongoing discussions around negotiations and sales. And it comes back, in my mind, to kind of balancing outcomes and relationships. So how do you think about negotiations with existing customers versus trying to bring on new customers in this particular environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's a good question. I mean, I think part of it is, both of the, I respect, I have a great deal of admiration for what a lot of the kind of ordeals that people are going to go through in the next few months or have been going through. And I think, as EJ says, is that that's going to consist of trying to make the best of existing clients or customers that you have, and new customers. And I think that obviously how you create revenues and things like that in this circumstance is going to require that you do both of those. I think part of it is I'm going to talk a little bit about decision making on Thursday. It's not so much a negotiation problem. I think that part of it is it's a question about where you should be kind of spending your scarce amount of time, whether you should be spending it kind of by going elsewhere or by trying to make the best of the kinds of existing things that you have. And I think that's a hard thing to do. Now, given the fact that I think there is a kind of question about what to do with kind of existing and new customers. I think one of the things is, as I said before, listening is a really important thing. And I think that one of the things that it's easy to focus on your hardship in this particular circumstances. And there's lots of hardship that many of you are facing. I think the thing is, don't let that crowd out the listening about the hardship of your clients and customers and so on. And I think what that means is that it's likely that they are going through at least as much of an ordeal as you are. And I think that you may not be able to fix that per se, but what you can do is you can talk about that. And I think that hearing them out and hearing what they're going through, I think is a really important part of the negotiation.
All right, George, we've got two questions.
My dog just broke into my office, so if you hear yapping, then that's
no worries.
at this point.
We have
that's modern parts of doing business, I think.
Exactly. We have two questions just related to particular perspectives. One, just any particular issues that you think in negotiations startups may face that are unique. And then the other relates to particular perspectives that nonprofits might face in negotiations.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the issues is certainly with one issue with startups, of course, is that they're oftentimes, not always, obviously, some startups are going to be doing products that are relatively well established, and they'll be just doing it in a different or more efficient way. I think a lot of products are just new, and I think part of the difficulty in that is that what you have to do is you have to do sales, which is you have to convince others that something that you're throwing out to the market, which is untried, unproven, at least untried or unproven to them, is something that's worth buying, and that in addition, even once you do that, you have to get them to agree on the price. And I think one thing that it is hard about that is that the two things relate to each other. And I think that when you're trying to sell a product, that one thing that I might do, for example, if I'm buying that product, is I might play. There's my dog trying to chew things. I might try. Hang on, my dog is eating something that he shouldn't. All right. Sorry. That I might try to pretend that product is not worth as much as you say. In other words, that what I'm trying to do is I'm playing dumb. I'm not actually dumb. I'm playing dumb so that I can basically buy this product I think part of it is that, as I like to say, is that one of the ways that you need to think about this is that what you have to do is you have to figure out whether your counterpart in this negotiation is, quote, playing dumb, in the sense that they don't fully appreciate, that they full well know the value of product, they're just using this as leverage, or, quote, they are dumb in the sense that they just need to be educated about what the value is, in which case it's sales and then negotiation. And the first one, it's really about negotiation.
All right, George, the next question comes in related to the balance of power and negotiation. For the player who has less power, there is often a mental state of fear. How does one address the psychological aspect of fear in negotiation?
You know, I think what the Walmart example teaches me is that not always, but there usually is some leverage that you have in negotiation. It may not be a big source of leverage. It actually may be a much bigger source than you appreciate. But part of it is, as I said, just to imagine a kind of audacious outcome and then ask yourself how you got there. And I think that part of it is, you know, there oftentimes in negotiation is this excessive focus on your own weaknesses in negotiation. You know, it's kind of like the Edgar Allan Poe, the Telltale Heart. It's like you're focusing on the beating of your heart as assuming that everybody can basically sense this. And it never occurs to you that the other side's heart, their heart is beating just as fast as you. In other words, they're afraid and frightened just as much as you are. Now, that's not always the case. I mean, if you're typically negotiating with Walmart, they're not that fearful relative to you. You are absolutely fearful. But, you know, I think it oftentimes is missed exactly how that is. And I think that one of the things I often ask my students do in the sort of calm is to ask, to ask if there's a trick being used or there's this tactic or something like, why did that work? Why was that successful? And oftentimes I think it helps them to recognize that, there was something that was going on that they didn't pick up. So let me give you an example. One of the things is, I think that oftentimes what people do is they make outrageous demands at the end of the negotiation and people give in. And I ask, why do you give in? And somebody says something like, after a while, that I give in because I'm tired. All right. And I ask them, what's the implication of that? And then eventually somebody will say, well, you know what? The other side is tired too. And that should be obvious. But the thing that I think is amazing is everybody just focuses on the fact that they're exhausted and they want to get this negotiation done. They don't recognize that the same thing is going on the other side, and the thing that's being used as leverage against them is also the leverage that they could use. So to the extent that what you do is you insinuate that you're willing to drag this negotiation out for a real long time, that's a way of turning the cards in the negotiation.
All right, so George, that relates to a question that came in. So I just want to see if you've got any additional clarification here. So in particular, as it relates to coming to an impasse, where the other side is looking to take advantage of a distressed party like a small business, generally, how can you get past an impasse and think about new sources of leverage?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, there will be, I think as I said before, is there's going to be disruption, and what that means is there's going to be, there'll be lots of people losing, but there'll also be some people who are who have cash and who are going to use this as opportunities. And I think there's a couple of things. One is, as I said before, sometimes there just aren't the resources to go around to make certain deals make sense, and that's unfortunate. And I think it's just a reality that good negotiation can't eliminate that. Second is that I think sometimes there are things that sensibly kind of unify the kinds of positions. So one thing is, we talked about rent abatement and things like that, but one kind of arrangement that some organizations are trying to do is that they really are trying to essentially create partnerships, either through equity or revenue sharing or things like that. And presumably the idea here is that it's in everybody's interest to make sure that you walk out of this as a survivor and in good condition and so on. I think the other thing is the thing that I said before, which is there will be situations where people have a lot of leverage. And I think part of it is, I do think that appeals to fairness oftentimes are the best card there. It's not going to work all the time, but I think if it does, then it's a pretty powerful thing. And I think it's part of it is it's very hard for people to really have to admit that what I'm doing is I'm being unfair and I'm taking advantage of this situation.
All right, George, I wanted to come back to a point that you had as a main part of negotiations about active listening.
Yep.
And in particular, in this type of environment where we're often not seeing people, or if we're seeing them, we're covered, things like that. Do you have any perspectives on how to be performing active listening and when you may not be seeing your customers in person?
It's a great question. I mean, I think one is, a lot of people are learning Zoom or WebEx or Skype or whatever, those kinds of things that are video. And I think that once you get over the obstacles, I think people are kind of astonished at how high fidelity it is in terms of connection. So one is that I think it is important to use video conference if you can. I think it does help. It makes people more real. I think the second thing is if you can, if you're on the phone, and I think a lot of people naturally, just because of whatever, for lots of reasons, they're going to be using phone conversation, and I think that what that does is that just makes the burden tougher, but not insurmountable. So, if EJ and I are talking on the phone, there's no reason that what I can't do is, I can't say. So EJ, I think the question that you asked me was how active listening is inhibited in this world in which people don't negotiate face-to-face. Is that correct? And so on. And I think that, one thing is, especially this time, is that, I think people are isolated. A lot of people are lonely as a result. I think feeling connection with people, feeling heard, I think that's a currency that is extremely valuable these days. And you have to remind yourself that the kind of vehicle that you use in face-to-face, it's kind of easier to do. And virtual, like this, is a little harder because it's unnatural. People aren't looking eye to eye, and people are looking away or whatever. And in phone, it's the hardest. And in email, email is probably the hardest of all those things. So those things, but it doesn't mean that we can't connect and make people feel heard and appreciated and respected. And I think that one of the things here is that we all want to tell our own story, but people want their story told too. And I think that's an important part of what's going to make relationships successful and then negotiations successful.
So George, as we get close to the wrap up today, I was hoping that you could offer some suggestions for other resources or places that you think people might look, particularly if they're coming from a small business perspective?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are a lot. I looked around for stuff about crisis per se, and I couldn't find anything that was particularly highlighted in crisis. I mean, I think, I think part of it is lots of good negotiation books. Almost every negotiation book, they're going to have kind of they're going to have crummy stories in which basically people took crummy situations and made good things out of them. I think that's sort of the backbone of a good negotiation book. So almost any negotiation book has amazing examples. They're just not going to be super tailored to this circumstance. But I think that's true of a lot of stuff that we teach in management schools and things like that. So there are lots of great books and things like that. I can put together a set of resources that I like that Polsky can post.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, George. And I wanted to acknowledge there were a number of other questions related to dealing with negotiations as it might relate to creditors, with bank lines, utilities, etc. And I'm going to suggest for anyone that's interested in that particular topic that you join us again at 2 o'clock. The next session for the Polsky Small Business Bootcamp is around navigating access to capital. And so we'll have a number of representatives on that webinar that will be specific to dealing with the financial system and different things that are going on as it relates to that. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today. George, thank you so much for spending some time with us and small business owners all across the world. We greatly appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing, hopefully seeing people back at the Polsky Small Business Bootcamp throughout the rest of the week. Thank you so much.
Best of luck to all of you.
Thank you.